Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming out to today's partner session. We're super happy to have Val with us today, who'll be talking about meaningful animation for UX. My name is Tiffany C. I'm a partnerships, education, and front-end developer advocate here at Shopify, and I'll be helping to get things started and help moderate today's session with Val. For those of you who might get cut out or have to leave halfway through the presentation or your connection drops or anything like that, we'll be recording the webinar and providing everyone with a copy by the end of the week. So if you have questions, feel free to ask them throughout the presentation using the questions panel and go to webinar, and we'll try to answer your questions at the end of the webinar. Now on to our host. I'm proud to introduce Val, a web and UI animation pro specializing in motion styles and web animation training. She's spoken at conferences like An Event Apart and at Smashing Conf, and she's the author of Designing Interface Animation, available through Rosenfeld Books. And if that wasn't enough, she also curates a weekly inspiring UI animation newsletter. I've had the privilege of working with Val here at Shopify when she came to help out our UX teams with building an animation style guide, and she's one amazing teacher. So I won't make you wait any longer. I'm going to hand over the reins to Val, and we'll get started.
So thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. I'm super excited to do this, and it's really fun to get to do this from my office too, so I can talk to all of you about animating for UX, and we all get to just like hang out in our houses or offices or wherever else that is, easier than going into one place. So today I'm going to be talking about designing meaningful animation for UX, and I'll get into a little bit more as to why. So, it's pretty easy for us to identify like bad animation when we run into like really obtrusive animation or just like obnoxious animation, like a giant pink Good and Plenty floating around this website. If we notice it, we're like, oh, that thing is really big and it's in my way. That's not cool. We notice things like, we really notice animation when things get a little funny, like when we're trying to fill out a form like this, and we're like, what? Like, it's really slowing me down. We notice when animation is just like way too much and just totally, I don't even know what's happening here kind of thing. Like, we always notice animation in those cases. But of course, that's not the kind of animation we want to make. Like, we don't want to create animation like that. We want to create animation that is more informed and is better designed. But when we encounter animation that's really well designed, a lot of the time it's more invisible. We don't really notice that it's there or that it's happening. It just kind of is part of the experience, and it's something that we interact with. So the thing with animation, of creating like really good UI animation, creating animation that actually adds to the experience, creating animation that's really well designed, all of those things, that sort of invisible sense of animation, the way we get those is, or the way those exist, or something they all have in common, is having this combination of purpose and style. Like the really good UI animation, the stuff we don't really notice because it's so good, it doesn't get our attention as being animation, it's just part of the design. Those animations are there, they have a really good purpose, they know why they're there, the designers know why those animations are there, and they're done with a lot of style too, like they're designed well. Sometimes you can have an animation that like has a perfectly good purpose, but if it's animated very poorly, if it's like really kind of janky, or if it's too slow, or if it's just awkward, like it doesn't really work. So you need those two pieces of that idea of purpose and style. So I'm going to break down some of the ways we can get that, since it's so easy to miss them when you encounter them, because when they're done well, they're so invisible. So I'm going to be talking mostly about the purpose side of this. We'll be looking at finding that purpose and finding, the things that animation can do to add to the experience and add something positive, which are also the same kinds of things that, like, if you are in a design critique or in any sort of, design presentation or discussion of design, and you are trying to, discuss or establish why it is you want to use animation in a design, these purposes would be the reason for that too. When you can find a good purpose for animation, you can make it part of the design and fit in well with the experience and the overall design, as opposed to it being this weird extra thing that gets tossed on top, because that never works. So let's look at some ways we can animate with purpose. Another way to put that is to talk about like design problems animation can solve. You know, animation is one design tool we have at our disposal. Not everything has to be animated. Not everything that uses animation has to use a ton of animation. And you know, animation can't solve every design problem. Like if you have a product that is really poorly designed, tossing some animation on is not going to fix it. But there's some of these more specific design problems that we run into often that animation can be a possible solution for. Not the only solution, but a solution that could work depending on the context and what you're doing, which I think is an important thing to lay out because it's like you can use animation for as many things as you want, but sometimes, depending on your goals, animation may or may not be the best way to solve these problems. But we're going to look at how animation can solve some of these problems. So one of the big things that animation can contribute to is creating a better sense of orientation and creating some context in your interfaces. A lot of the times you run into problems, especially when we're designing things for, you know, all the different size viewports out there, giant monitors like the one I'm looking at right now, and tiny phones like the one that's on my desk. You know, we end up having to create sort of like layers in our interfaces or have interface elements that are off screen or somewhere else where they're not visible. And it can be a challenge, you know, it can be a bit of a design problem to figure out how to communicate to the people using our products where those things that they can't see right now are, or to help them remember that those things exist. And, you know, it's not that they're not anywhere, it's just they're not currently visible. So a few ways animation can help with that. We'll look at some examples. Cotton Bureau does this really well where they have their menu off to the left and they have all of their cart things off to the right. And they use just a very simple transition to show you where those things are and establish this, this kind of spatial map, if you will, or this mental model of where those things are even when you can't see them. So I'll play this video. You have their animation there to the left. And then if you go and want to look at your cart, and then that last bit, you can see they even keep that progression going. Like as you step through the checkout process, they just keep moving you a little bit to the right. And that very consistent motion, even though it's very small, the fact that it's done in such a logical way and you know, in a way that makes it seem like it's physical space, they've communicated to you where these things are and how they're related to each other. Even though like right now we can't see the navigation. And when we started out, we couldn't see either the cart or the navigation. Once you start using this, these transitions help you see where those are. If you know, this site would totally work if those transitions weren't there, if it was just kind of like a hard cut, suddenly your cart appeared or suddenly the navigation appeared. But without those transitions, it would feel really awkward. You'd wonder, like, where did that navigation come from? What just happened? Did I break something? Like the transitions smooth that out and make it obvious where things came from because you can see them coming in and out as opposed to just appearing. Google Fonts does some good things with orientation as well, where they have, this is the newly designed Google Fonts, so I guess not super new, but still so much nicer than the old Google Fonts that was, I don't know, just not very designer-like, where they use some, they have some different layers in their interface where they have like where you can pick the fonts, and then they have the place where you collect the fonts that you're using, and they intentionally put those on different planes. So if we're in here and we're like, hey, we added a font, that little thing from the bottom comes up showing us we have this other context. And they also do a really good job of like separating the difference between that modal window and the tabs within it. So the modal window itself kind of goes up and down, comes in and out, like it shows that it's there, it animates in an upward direction when you're using it, and then like kind of shrinks back down. But you always see it going up and down, so you know exactly where it is, and it establishes its location there at the bottom of the screen. Then when you're in that modal, they have the tabs going left to right to kind of distinguish those different areas of the interface, even though you can't see them all. They're really communicating that orientation of where things are, even though they don't fit on your screen currently. Context is a little bit different, kind of maintaining those contexts or connecting contexts. Google Fonts does that super well as well in their little color picker icon, which if we play that, so you can change all of these colors, but as we're doing it, that color selection menu comes out of that little paint icon and always goes back in it. So you know, in a sense, I mean, you know, we all know that's not really how it works, but in a sense, you're like, oh, the color picker, like the color palette is inside that paint bucket. We know that's not really true because it's a screen and there's not actual things like that, but you make that connection and can tell where that is and where it came from, which gives you that sense of like, okay, now we're in the context of picking colors, but if I want to get back there, I know it comes in and out of the paint can. Those colors live in the little paint fill can. Which is a really great way to keep those kinds of things straight. In this case, it's just one small menu, but when you have many other options or many other menus or many other contexts, having that transition between them, showing where they come from and where they go back to, can make a huge difference in establishing this idea of like where you are and where things are located. One that's a little bit different, but one that I really like as well, is this idea of using like a card flip animation to differentiate between two different options. In this particular checkout, I guess, cart, Gumroad gives you, the option to either pay by credit card or with PayPal. And I'll play this first before I talk about it. So they give you that option of switching between the two, and this does a few different things. Like, it makes it really obvious that it's an either-or situation. You could pay with PayPal, or you can pay with your credit card. When there's forms that like lay out both the PayPal and the credit card like one after the other in one flow, it's really easy to get confused and maybe start filling out one when you meant to fill out the other. By having this kind of card flip, that doesn't happen because they replace each other. And the actual flipping transition is what gives you that information of how they're related, that it is either, it's like a coin toss in a way. You can pay with one or the other, and it's totally fine. They also save themselves a ton of space and make this form seem really simple because it is so short and compact. They have those different options, but they compact them nicely and use that transition to show you the relationship between the two and kind of get you from one place to the other. So it's a really nice addition to their form and makes it both easier to use and easier to tell what's going on. So that's our orientation and context stuff, the things that transitions really, all of these animations we've looked at so far are actually, the animations themselves are quite simple and quite small. The way they solve this problem of establishing the context or the orientation, the context or the spatial relationship, is more in the way that they work, where they come from and where they go, how they make that connection, less so in them being fancy. Animations don't have to be fancy to be useful. They just have to be well placed. So kind of going on from there of the whole idea of the context and orientation, animation can also be really useful at helping to guide tasks. A lot of the times the things we're building on the web are like, they're not necessarily just your like basic brochure site of like, hey, about us, things like that. There are people using your product are actually trying to get something done. Maybe they're trying to buy something. Maybe they're working with data and changing things and saving things. There's more to be done than just like click on a thing and wait for a page to load. And we can use animation to help make what those tasks are easier or to help make them more clear as you go along. There's a good example in Google Docs where they use actually quite a bit of animation to help you move documents around into different folders. Your Google Docs folder can get pretty crazy. I think I have about like 50 billion thousand Google Docs at this point. So it's nice to have this little extra aid of showing you how things are working and how you're moving things around. So I'll play this one. So there's a good bit of animation going on there. Like when you select all of your documents, you see them kind of get all sucked up together in a pile. And then you get that little number telling you how many documents you have. Those follow your mouse around until you drop them into a place. You get that little background color change showing you that you found an acceptable place to drop those documents. And then the documents actually just kind of animate backwards in space. Like they have a good 3D effect there of them all kind of like falling into the folder. And that's a lot of animation for what you could consider a very small task, but it is a task that's kind of complex. Because once you have once you have some documents selected, it's really easy to forget how many documents you have. It's maybe not really obvious where you can drop them. So they've added all of these animations to help guide you through that task of collecting up documents and moving them to another place. Notes, the actual desktop app of Notes, which is Apple Notes, does something kind of similar, where they give you the same idea when you collect up documents or files. They give you that kind of like pile, they give you the little number as well. And they also have a nice little like scaling up animation to show you where it's okay to drop things and kind of make these documents almost feel more like alive in a way, where little screenshots are kind of floating around. And the way they kind of float around lets us know where we're allowed to drop stuff into our new note or onto our desktop or wherever else. All of this guiding tasks doesn't necessarily have to be like a super serious thing, or it doesn't have to be so much of like, you are doing this thing and this is a complex and very serious task and we will help you and all of these things. It can be that, but you can also have a little bit of fun with it too. This is the sign-up form for a README app, which is an online service, and you can sign up and create an account. And when you go and do that, here's how the form works. So as you're filling out the form, this little owl, who is their kind of mascot, their owl, I don't know, friend. I'm trying to think of what his name is, but I don't know if it has a name. The owl actually points to the current form field that you're on with his little owl eyes and his little feather owl hand, kind of moving with you throughout the form, essentially guiding you through filling out that form. Now, of course, this form is very short. We also have that little like completely forgetting the name of it right now, but that little blue outline to show us which form field is active. So the owl isn't the only thing showing us where we are in the form, but it's a really nice combination of getting a little bit of brand personality in there while also helping you get through this form and actually offering something useful as well. We've all definitely seen some character, I don't know what I would call them, some brand characters done poorly. If you've ever encountered, Microsoft's Clippy, that particular character is generally not considered to be super helpful. Most users got annoyed with him versus finding Clippy actually useful. But this is a really great combination of kind of adding that brand personality, having that animated character, and using it in a way that's still useful to the people actually using your stuff. This owl also comes back on their sign-in form, where he's kind of perched above the sign-in form, and he covers up his eyes with his feather hands, or with his wings, I guess. Wings make more sense. He covers his eyes with his wings when you get to the password field. So they really carry this through really well, and it's a really great example of, branding animation, character animation for branding done well. Somewhat related to guiding tasks is this idea of giving feedback as well, where it kind of this problem sort of stems from the same place. When people are doing more complex tasks online, when like I said, when you're doing more than just clicking a button, loading a new page, there's things that are happening that might require more useful feedback, more nuanced feedback than just like your new page is loading. And that's one area where animation can help you give better feedback as well. So we'll look at Stripe, just one particular animation that they have, which is their error animation if you make a mistake or leave a form field blank on their form. So when you make, when there's blank form fields, when there's an error made on their form here, the whole form actually like shakes at you. And it's kind of a very, almost like lifelike animation in a sense, and it's sort of like it's shaking your head at you, even though we know it's not actually a person, but it gives it like that kind of metaphor in a sense of it just being like, no, that's not right, you can't submit it that way. So they really make that error obvious with their animation, giving you that feedback that like, hey, you probably forgot something, maybe try again. They have a very similar animation on smaller viewports where obviously this whole modal couldn't really fit, but they use a very similar motion, but instead of shaking the whole modal area, they actually just shake a small red arrow in each of the form fields that that have an error or have an omission. So they keep that kind of related motion throughout the various viewport sizes. Of course, feedback doesn't always have to be a bad thing. Feedback can also be, not necessarily errors, but things that are going well, and basically some helpful information that things really are happening. When you give feedback with animation, you also have this opportunity to essentially compact a lot of feedback into a very small amount of space. So this is also from the Stripe form. If we had filled out the form correctly and we're actually donating money, in the end, our animation would look like this. So that one button ends up being both like the submit button for the form. It's kind of the progress indicator, the loading indicator that like, hey, some information is going back and forth between you and the server. We're making your payment. And then it's also the success feedback of that button turning green and the check mark being animated in. So it's showing you all that information, everything from submitting to loading to the success state, all in a very small amount of space. This could have been done by adding additional messages to the screen and all that kind of stuff. There's plenty of ways to give that feedback, but the fact that they chose to use animation and that element of time throughout, they were able to compact all of that information into a very small space. This idea of feedback and progress can also be, you can have a little fun with it too, sort of like the owl. This is a scrolling progress indicator on the flight report site. Where as you scroll, this little plane continues on its journey between the two cities you're reading about, or the particular flight you're reading about. So there's a lot, it's giving you a lot of information about how far you are, how far you have to go, how much more you have to read, but also having a little fun with it, being a little bit more than just your little browser scroll bar indicator. Fairly related to feedback, we can also show some cause and effect with animation. Helping people know what they're doing while they're doing it. If feedback is, in a sense, confirming that something is happening, showing the cause and effect of an action can let you give an indication of what's happening before it actually happens, kind of hinting at things that could be an effect of certain action, or hinting at actions that could take place. Clear does this really well. Clear is a to-do list app. I believe it's only desktop and mobile, or like an iOS app. I don't think they have a web version, but that's okay. They give you a whole lot of feedback through animation, showing you, when you've completed a task. So as you complete tasks, you see something like this. As each task is completed, essentially, as you check them off, it turns green to kind of congratulate you and be like, yes, you got a thing done, good, go you. Then it turns gray and animates down to the bottom of the screen and being crossed out. So it's kind of still there, but accomplished. That happens for all of them. And then when you decide to dismiss all the ones that are done, it just animates nicely down to the bottom of the screen. So, that success and crossing out animation is pretty complex and showing you that effect of what happens when you cross off all of your to-do items. And that was a really easy to-do list, but that's okay. We'll pretend that's what happens to all of our to-do lists all the time. Drag and drop interactions is a place where this becomes really important. And I always think this one is kind of very eye-opening. If you've ever had to design a drag and drop experience, it's actually really hard. We encounter drag and drop interactions all the time, but so much of the little cues and these hints of cause and effect, so much of them are things that just they happen, they help us, but we don't really notice them. There's so much of that when we go to build them ourselves or create them ourselves, remembering how all of those cues that are needed can be really difficult. It's one of those things that's so much harder to make, at least make well, than it is to use. But a lot of, this is Google Keep, but there's a lot of similar drag and drop interactions out there where it uses animation to both show you, give you a preview of where things can be dropped and what will happen if you reorganize your notes in that way, as well as some indication as to exactly where you're allowed to drop things or not. So I'll play this and I'm sure it will look familiar. Or like as you're moving your individual notes, the rest of them animate into their new position, giving you that preview of what will happen before you actually drop it. And this one even has that little bit of a shadow animation where when you pick it up, they give it that extra sense of depth. And then when you drop it, it goes back down kind of on the same plane as the rest of them. So there's a lot of nuanced information that you're getting through animation in a lot of these drag and drop interactions. And when those aren't there, it becomes very awkward feeling. So in things like this, it's almost like they're expected, and you notice more when they're missing than if they're there. Animation can also be used in the sense to, hint at affordances, showing you essentially that maybe you need to change your behavior. Instead of showing you the cause and effect of the behavior you are doing, they can be used to kind of show what you should be doing instead. This one is slightly out of date now that iOS has changed all of this slide to unlock stuff, but it's still a really good example. In earlier versions of iOS, if you wanted to open your camera, you would actually just like tap the camera icon. But they changed it, I think around probably iOS 7 perhaps, where you actually had to swipe up on the icon as opposed to click it. So to help kind of teach you that, if you tried to click on the camera icon, this is what would happen. Instead of opening up your camera, it would just give you this little animation to be like, nope, you mean to swipe up, kind of hinting at that gesture that you now need to make to open your camera. This animation kind of has a double purpose as well. Besides showing you that, that gesture that it wants you to do, it's also showing you, creating that sense of spatial relationship too that we looked at earlier, where when your home screen slides up and you see the camera behind it, it creates that sense that like, your camera is always ready and waiting right behind your home screen. All you have to do is just swipe your home screen up out of the way, and there's your camera. It's creating that sense of layering in space. Of course, now it doesn't quite work like that, but that's okay. We can go back to Clear to see some of this hinting at affordances as well. When you're typing items on your to-do list, there's this little animation showing you that like the next task is just ready and waiting for you to fill it out. That you don't have to hit a plus button or anything else to add new tasks. They just give you this idea that like keep typing, and they show you a little animation to encourage that. So as you're typing your tasks, the next task just kind of like rotates down a little bit, showing you it's just waiting right behind there, and all you have to do is keep typing. So again, it's doing both that idea of hinting at affordances of like how to get to the next step, as well as creating some of that sort of spatial awareness. It's kind of suggesting that all of your to-do lists are folded up in this strange 3D accordion behind the ones you already have, which may or may not be true depending on how many you fill out. One of the most powerful things about animation and about using animation as a design tool is how good it is at getting attention, how good it is at like claiming attention and directing attention to the things that are moving. It's kind of like one of those things that it's both good and bad. It's a good thing and a bad thing about animation. If you think about all of the wonderful things like banner ads, or these days those like lovely modals that like come and animate in over top of the article you're trying to read to tell you to sign up for their newsletter, even though you just want to read this article. A lot of those things, the reason why they animate is to pull your attention towards them. The reason it was so popular to have banner ads that were animated was because an animated banner off to the right of the screen that's kind of in your peripheral vision, that has a better chance of making you look at that right column where the banner is, as opposed to looking at the content you want to read. The fact that it's moving catches your eye and makes it so you almost end up looking at it even though you don't want to. So this kind of attention-grabbing power of animation is something that, at least in the past, or at least in the case of maybe some things like banner ads that are trying to pull your attention to something you don't want to pay attention to, you can make the case that they're often used for like evil, because I like to be dramatic. The sense of like they're used in a negative way. They're used to pull your attention away from the thing you want to pay attention to, and that's really one of the things that's led to a lot of people's negative opinions about animation and UI at all. if the only animation you've ever encountered is in at least on the web or in apps is this banner ad trying to pull you away from what you want to read, of course you're going to hate animation. The fun thing about this attention-grabbing power of animation, though, is if we pair that attention-grabbing power with information that people actually want to read, the most important information to them, we have this really great pairing. So if we use it for good, you could say, instead of evil, the effects are much more pronounced. Fitbit does this really well on both their website and their iOS app. The only thing that animates on any of their things, on these particular things anyways, is your actual information, which is the stuff you want to come to Fitbit for, right? Like, if you're here on Fitbit, you want to know, did I get to my steps today? Did I, walk my 10,000 steps or my 5 miles? Can I have that donut? Like, that's what you want to know. And that's the only thing that animates on Fitbit's site. So when you go and load it up, it shows you all of the bars of your activity filling in. It shows you the animation of your accomplishments, like if you've hit your 10,000 steps and your goals, it gives you those happy faces. And that's really all that moves here. All of the guide for the activity graph, all of those numbers, that's all there and static. And then the actual data is what gets animated in, nothing else. They carry this over really well to the iOS app as well, where the same thing, the only thing that animates, the only thing that has that attention-grabbing power of motion is the information, is your information, the stuff you actually want to see. So same idea, just different layout. The bars animate in, showing you how much you've accomplished. The little icons rotate around, showing you, like, congratulations. And it just goes like that for all the different days. In a sense, this one's kind of interesting, too, because they've actually left out any transitions between the different days and the different screens on the iOS app. So you can switch days and you almost don't know it. So they've really stripped this down to having animation being only for your information, which is a really powerful statement to make in their design. Animation can be used to direct your attention on things that maybe have a lot of different stuff going on that you need to pay attention to. This is a form for Stitch Fix, which is a service where they send you some clothes and you try them on at home, and then you fill out this form to decide what you're going to keep and what you're going to return. So if you decide, for example, that you don't want to keep this sweater, they have a little animation crossing out the price to reinforce that idea and to call your attention to the idea that, like, you are not going to be charged for this. So it's a very quick one in that sense. It's a very small one in the idea you hit return it and the price just kind of has this little jabby cross-out animation. And in one sense, that's useful since they're on opposite sides of the screen. That little movement can catch your attention even though you might have been focused on the return it button. And it really reinforces that sense of, like, don't worry, you don't have to pay for this. Sometimes this whole idea of directing attention can be quite exaggerated as well. CodePen has a really exaggerated animation on their save button, which is exactly designed to get your attention. If you are entering a bunch of code in CodePen and you haven't saved it, you're going on, you're writing all this stuff, and if you haven't saved it, because it's browser-based, it's a browser-based code editor, if you haven't saved it, you could lose it all if you refresh or, all of the various things that could happen with your browser. So if you haven't saved any of your work after a certain amount of time, CodePen actually shakes its save button at you like this. Where it's a pretty dramatic animation. It definitely is going to grab your attention. If you ignore it and continue to not save, it'll actually even start shaking more dramatically. But it's a good pairing to the task because to you as the person using CodePen, saving your work is really important. You want to know if you've forgotten to save, so that very exaggerated animation fits that very well because it's really important that you know you're not saving your work. It's really important you click that save button so you don't lose your work. So the animation is paired very well for its purpose there. If that same animation, if that same shaking button was like on every button in their navigation, it would be way too much and we would totally hate it. It would just not be good. It would not be fun to interact with. But the fact that that really over-the-top animation is paired with a thing that's very important to you makes the context, it changes the context entirely and makes it be something you're like, makes it something that's less of, it fits well and is less of a kind of standout sort of thing, or at least stand out in a bad way. Perceived performance is another place where animation can really help out. I like to think of this as kind of like the magic part of things that animation can do, even though, I mean, there's tons of fun, magical things, I suppose, you can do with design and animation in general. But, there's definitely cases where, we try to make all of our stuff, all of the things we make, be as performant as possible, to work as quickly as possible, to have as little waiting as possible. But there's still cases where, we have to wait for things. Whether, we're waiting to hear back from a server, waiting to save something. There's just cases where no matter what you do, something needs to be loaded or exchanged or whatever, and there's just no way to avoid some sort of waiting or some sort of waiting time. And we can actually sort of fill in some of that waiting by using animation to essentially create the sense that things are happening faster than they are, which is why I sometimes like to pretend like it's magic. So there's a few different ways we can do this. One way we see a lot is the idea of skeleton content. So if you've seen something like this on Facebook, where you have these sort of like animated gradient lines that show you something's loading, we don't know what yet, but I promise you'll have a post or something, something like this. That gives you the sense of having the content sooner than it really is. Like the sooner they show those gray bars that are kind of animating, the sooner they show those, the faster you feel like the content is loading, even though it hasn't happened any faster. If you were just looking at a plain screen, you would feel like a lot more time had passed. And one of the interesting things I find with skeleton content is, we can have these little animated shapes showing you that, like, don't worry, stuff is loading, it's cool, we're good. Those kind of, the shape of that skeleton content and what the skeleton content shows doesn't have to match the real content. Like in this particular one, it showed us a little square and some lines that supposedly were probably meant to represent like a text-based post. That got replaced by a video, but the effect was still there. It still seemed like the content was loading faster than it was. That's also why we see some loading things like this, where in the Twitter app on your phone, when it loads, we have this animation of the Twitter icon kind of like sinking back into space and then animating forwards to present you your Twitter app. And that little bit of a loader animation, despite the fact that it's not really your typical like spinner or anything like that, it really makes it seem like more is happening, or things are happening faster than just waiting on a blue screen for your Twitter app to load. So you've probably seen this when loading Twitter. Oops, if it'll play. There you go. And of course, in that case, I still got a spinner. But it's really hard to see that animation if you have like a decent internet connection, because it's tough to see that loading one. You have to try many times. Oh, and I actually have a Shopify example in here too. Who knew? When we're loading things, it can also be really helpful to focus on the progression, focus on what's happening. Let me get a little further into this. Like once you create an account here, you see a loading. Oh, sorry, someone already had Val Store, so I had to come up with a better name, like Super Awesome Store. But as you're creating a new account, you get this loading sequence that kind of animates through these steps. It's like, hey, step 1 of 2, or 1 of 4 rather, 2 of 4, kind of focusing you on the progression of what's happening as opposed to a generic spinner or something. And this idea of keeping you focused on the progress, even though these 4 steps are probably not happening exactly in that order or exactly when they show up, the fact that you're looking at something that is progressing and is tailored to the specific thing you're waiting for feels like it's happening a lot faster, feels like it's a lot more productive than just seeing a generic spinner going, and then you're stuck wondering if anything is even actually happening. the folks at Viget have actually done some interesting experiments around this, or I guess one specific experiment around this, where they set up an experiment to essentially investigate how long people would wait for loading animations. This study that they did, I think it's a little bit funny in the sense that like they weren't actually loading anything. They were quite literally just seeing how long people would wait when they saw a loader. So I don't know. I thought that was kind of an amusing side note about that. It's like, oh, there really is nothing loading. Okay. What they did is they looked at a variety of different kinds of loaders. They tested really generic spinners, very generic loading messages against very customized loading animations. And they found that people would wait longer if the animation was very customized to the context. You know, in their case, if they showed a very nicely animated Viget logo, people would wait longer than if they just like saw a generic spinner that they've seen a million times. So in that sense, by paying attention and really handling those loading times with care, you know, designing a specific loading experience, even if you don't know how long that loading time will take, can really go far into both showing your users that you care and making that time seem like it goes by faster. Some examples of that are Sure Payroll has this loader while it's calculating your payroll. They have no idea how long that's going to take, because you could be processing a payroll for like 1,000 people. You could be processing a payroll for one person. They don't know. But instead of showing a generic spinner, they've made a very customized animation for the context of what you're waiting for. You know, they show this little calculator, and it's kind of, you know, that's what's happening behind the scenes. Somewhere on some server, your payroll is being calculated and assembled. But the fact that they show this as opposed to just like a generic spinner makes you have more confidence that something is happening, and it makes it seem like it's not taking as long as it is. You know, get that kind of perceived performance benefits, even though you can't tell them like we're at step 1 or step 4 because you don't have that information. One of my favorite examples of this is the free agents exporting animation. If you use free agent for a while, you can go and like export all of the data for your account. But of course, they don't know how much data you have, so it could take any amount of time. And they show you this little looping loader, which I find pretty fun because it's a bunch of numbers jumping into a box. And that's kind of what's really happening when you're exporting all your accounting data. Yeah. I haven't come across anyone who is as amused by this loader as I am, but it's one of my favorite loaders of all time. So anyways, there's also an interesting study talking about waiting and loading done by Facebook. They don't really give us a lot of details on how the study was conducted or a lot of details of the study itself, but they did have a really interesting conclusion where they found that customized loaders that were custom to an app, made people think the app was slow when they encountered them, and more generic loaders, ones that looked like they might be from the phone, made people blame their phone when they saw those and thought it was taking too long. So it's an interesting balance in designing these and the animations and what kind of things might be perceived from them. So it's kind of like a counter to the Viget one, though the Viget study has a lot more detail, I think, and makes it a little easier to apply to your own work. This one has a lot of, it's an interesting one for sure, but there's definitely a lot of questions that you have after reading about this one. So I wanted to also talk a little bit about some principles of interactive animation. You know, all of those things we just talked about, the things like showing this orientation, showing feedback, and, you know, cause and effect, are all the kind of purposes, the really useful things that animation can do when we include it as part of our design and include it in you know, our UI design or create UI animation. But there's also some things we want to do to really, you know, like make sure our animation is behaving well, is pleasant to interact with, perhaps. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that too. So one really helpful thing to do is to keep your UI animations flexible. And we saw that in a number of the examples we looked at already. I've kind of pulled out one that is like, I guess the most obvious or the easiest to show in isolation, which is the Remember Me Everywhere checkbox in Stripe. if we play, took a little screenshot of it, and essentially you can uncheck and check this box as fast or as many times as you want, and no matter what, the form will respond exactly as expected. So if we play this little screen capture, as you're checking the box, these details kind of rotate down, and you'll notice that even if I uncheck the box before that animation is finished, it still goes back up into place. I never have to wait for the animation to finish before I can, see the next state. It just does whatever I tell it to. I'm like, check, uncheck, and it's fine with it. It never has to, it's always, this form is always receiving that input about that checkbox. It's never ignoring clicks. It's never ignoring me as the user. Hopefully, people aren't checking and unchecking that checkbox like 100 times like I was doing. But when things respond to you instantly, when these animations change direction based on your input, or change their destination based on user input quickly, and as soon as you change your input, they feel very responsive to you, and they feel very much like they're listening to you, which is what you want. You want it to feel like the interface is responding to you and doing what you want it to do, and that you're in control as the person using it. You never want to feel like you have to wait for an animation to finish before you can do the thing that you actually wanted to do, because, well, that's what you were here to do. So let me just go, sorry, one small keynote thing. The second one that's very related is this idea of not creating obstacles. Try not to design obstacles into your animation. It's really easy to come up with an idea for animation that may sound really great. It might look really great too, but maybe it's not very pleasant to interact with. So you definitely want to avoid those kinds of situations. So you can have, you can have a lot of animation and still have things be readily available when you need them. For example, the Nixon watches navigation. They have a really big navigation. There's a lot of content in there. And they also have a lot of animation going on in their navigation, which is a very hard thing to say if you ever have to say it out loud. You have to, it's a tough one. But if you take a look at how their animation works, we'll play this video. As soon as we are kind of hovering over that navigation, it slides right down. When we change categories, those new categories slide right down into place. And you're never in a position where you're waiting for that animation, or you're never in a position where the animation is in the way of you getting something done. You can click on those things on the next selection you want to make just as quickly as with the animation as if when it's not there. It's not actually getting in your way. It's not creating an obstacle for you to navigate this site. But if you contrast that with something like the old squared site, which thankfully they have changed, but you used to have to go through a number of steps just to get to their main navigation, where you have to open the menu, this kind of takeover would happen, this modal would animate in, all the individual items would animate in, and you'd have to do that every time you wanted to interact with their navigation. Like I said, thankfully they've redesigned and it's not like this anymore. But that animation, creates a big obstacle between you, the person using the site, and their main navigation. You had to wait for those two things to fade in, this other thing to appear before you could make another selection. And that animation itself, it was done very well. It was nicely designed, nicely timed, but it's just placed in within the where the animation occurs is the problem, not the way it looks or what it does. The fact that you have to see that animation every time you want to open the main menu, which is something you do probably frequently if you're navigating a site, that's what makes it an obstacle. If that same animation was used for, say, like a modal window you saw only occasionally, it would be fine and it wouldn't feel like such an obstacle. So actually testing out your animations and prototyping animations, seeing how they feel to use, can be a really informative way to find out, where animations might feel like they're slowing you down or might get in your way. So kind of a good way to avoid both of those things. So one other helpful thing when actually implementing animations is to look at speed and readability as opposed to just duration. a lot of the time, or maybe not a lot of the time so much anymore, but definitely not that long ago, it seemed like there would be these tweet storms every once in a while of someone tweeting something like, I have decided that the best duration for all UI animations for the rest of time is, zero point 0.2 seconds or 200 milliseconds. Any animation faster than that or slower than that is wrong, and that is the speed, or the duration rather, that all my animations will be. I'm exaggerating the tweet, obviously. You could not fit that in 140 characters. But there's this kind of tendency sometimes to select one duration that is always the correct duration. But, that really kind of paints you into a corner if you go that direction. You're going to create better animation if you think more about readability as opposed to the total duration. Like we saw in all the examples we've looked at so far today, there's a lot of different kinds of UI animation. Some of them are very small, some of them cover a lot of ground, some of them move really large distances, and others move a very small distance. So you can't really pin those down to all one duration and still have it be, feel even and designed. So an easier way, I think, to work with that is, instead of going on a set duration, of thinking of things of more as like a range. So for example, 200 to 500 milliseconds is a pretty decent place to start for most small UI animations. Things like hovers and modals appearing and that kind of stuff. You want to kind of like give yourself different areas of that range depending on what you're doing. You might decide that like hover effects should all be really short. Maybe they're all like 150 to 200 milliseconds, and maybe large moves that go all the way across the screen, or some large menu animating in, maybe that takes a little bit more time. So give yourself that flexibility to pick a duration that fits the animation at hand versus one duration, one fits all kind of duration. You want to be able to change this up, and kind of coming up with a range that feels good to you and working within that as a starting point is a really good way to do that, and help you be flexible yet also have know where to start. Speaking of easing, ease outs can often feel more responsive, and this is that idea of like readability versus duration. An ease out, there's a little ease out sign graph down there. An ease out is an animation that's going to start more quickly and then slow down as it gets to its destination. So if you imagine something like a button or something like that, if it starts out quickly, it's going to feel like it's responding to your click or to your hover or your tap more immediately. If you use an easing that starts out very slow, like an ease in, that same button might just seem sluggish, even though it's doing the same thing. So the easing you choose can really affect how things are perceived. On that same idea, more complex easing is going to need more time to be readable. If we compare these two easing graphs, there's the ease in out bounce, it's a long one, on the left, versus the ease in out quad on the right. I really should have picked shorter names for these. There's a lot of action happening in that ease in out bounce curve. We've got those different bounces, there's a lot of speed changes. An animation using that kind of easing is going to need more time, a longer duration to be readable than an animation that uses the ease in out quad. So when you swap out different easings, sometimes you need to change your duration as well to still have that animation make sense, especially when things are bouncing or overshooting or any of those more complex actions, because it just takes that little bit more time. And that could be like more time of like 50 milliseconds or 100 milliseconds. It's not necessarily like a lot of time, but a small amount of extra time can make a big difference in how readable an animation is. And if we're going to be using animations in our interfaces, we want them to be readable, because if they're not readable, if you can't tell what's happened or you can't tell what's moved, kind of defeats the purpose of animating it in the first place. You don't want to be working against yourself. And the last principle I wanted to talk about was this idea of matching motion to your message. Animation is very expressive. I mean, design in general is very expressive, but animation can be especially noticeable in what it communicates, and just noticeable in general, as we were talking about with the directing attention. So when the animation you use doesn't match your brand or doesn't match your message, it can feel really strange. So I'll show you an example from a while ago. Again, this one's been redesigned since, so I don't feel bad showing it because they fixed it. But for a while, was the case. So we'll look at first the dots game and look at the kind of animation you see there. It's very springy, it's very quick. It's kind of almost like there's that really severe bounce at the end. It's all very, I want to say almost like stabby, but maybe more like, it always makes me think of like Elmo or Grover, like Muppet dancing, you know, when they do that sort of like around move their hands in a circle and kind of jerk around as they're dancing. It's very, it's very bouncy. It's very almost like definitely high energy, almost a little bit childish. Something that totally fits the dots game because it's a game and it's a lot, you know, we're moving these dots in and out. That animation works really, really well for the dots game menu. With that exact same animation, if you put it on, say, Apple's site in their product menu, it starts feeling really out of place. So you'll see these, right, in this version of the Apple site, that menu had the exact same, like, super springy, really, like, intense or very tense spring of motion, which, I mean, looks really cool for sure, but doesn't really fit the Apple brand, right? Like if you think about your MacBook or, you know, any of your Mac products, I don't really think of them of like bouncing around. I feel that I don't know, their personality is more like slick and like just more sophisticated and less bouncy, less energetic, because they're more of just like, they're just so cool. So that particular animation bothered me for a really long time while it was there because it just didn't fit the brand. The animation, the brand said such different things. It was very jarring and just, you know, felt not quite right. Thankfully, they've changed it. I think they've changed it even since this. But when that menu was reanimated somewhat recently, has a much better feel. Like that kind of nice staggered fade, like that feels a lot more Apple. That feels sophisticated and slick, and like that's how my MacBook should move. So, you know, your choice of easing can make a really big difference in how well your animation fits your message. And you want to make sure it does fit your message. That way you have that kind of cohesiveness and that idea of like your whole design is working towards the same goal, as opposed to like your animation fighting the rest of your design. So that's always one to keep in mind. I think matching your message to your motion can often be the hardest part about animating and creating UI animations that really feel like they're part of the overall design. So to end things off, I just wanted to talk about where to find some good animation. I mean, some good inspiration rather for animation. Oh geez, I'm mixing up words already. You know, a lot of the time as web designers, we haven't had to do a lot of work with motion, so we don't always know exactly how to judge what is good motion and what is not. So I think exposing yourself to more motion and more good motion is a great way to kind of establish your taste and style in motion. So a couple places that are really great to look for some inspiration. One of my very favorites is Art of the Title, which talks all about TV and movie titles. And they're often trying to tell stories with type and color, which is exactly what we do, so it's super informative. Another one that's really great is Captivate.co, which has two P's, but it's a really great gallery site that shows various animations from different apps and really gives you a sense of how those apps handle their animation, how things work together, and how it creates an experience through multiple animations. And then one that is that's more web specific is User Interface. And they actually collect up various web-based animations, web-based UI animations, into different categories. So it can be really helpful if, you know, for example, the one in the screenshot is like a drag interaction. If you need to create and animate a drag interaction, you can look at these categories and kind of see how other sites and other things have handled it, kind of get a sense of the idea of the patterns and maybe, you know, things that work well. It's so much easier than starting from like a blank page. So with that, if you want to learn more about designing interface animation and how animation can impact UX, I wrote a book about it recently. It's called Designing Interface Animation, and it is approximately half the height of a small terrier. You can find out more about the book at designinginterfaceanimation.com or on Rosenfeld Media's site. And with that, thanks so much for listening. I know we're going to do some questions and stuff, but hopefully you've had fun listening to some animation talk over your lunch or evening or whatever time it is for you. So thanks a lot.
Hey everybody, it's Tiffany back again. Thanks so much, Val. That was really awesome. Lots of comments on how cute your dog is.
She'll be happy to hear that.
So we had a few questions. One's from Pedro. He asks, animations seem really useful. Could you speak to how to handle animations in older browsers? And then maybe you can could you speak to maybe how it might relate back to progressive enhancement a little bit?
Oh yeah, I mean it definitely does. Older browsers, less capable devices, progressive enhancement really ties into that. You can, in the same sense, well, I guess just progressive enhancement in general, it's like you want to have a good base experience. The way Jeremy Keith always describes it, which is my favorite way to describe progressive enhancement, is like the core thing that your site or your app needs to do, that thing should be usable and accessible to anyone no matter what device they're using or what browser they're using, even if it's like a billion years old in web years, which I'm not sure what browser that would be, but you get the idea. But then you can layer things on top for more capable browsers. So yeah, maybe for older browsers, you just don't have animation. Maybe you just have your interface as a static thing and you only layer that in for more capable modern browsers. In some cases, that might not actually require a lot of effort. Things like CSS-based animation, if an older browser encounters CSS it doesn't recognize or doesn't understand, it just doesn't do it, right? So like if you went to a site with a lot of CSS animation with like even like IE8 or something, you just wouldn't see that animation. And you as a developer wouldn't have to do anything to make that, happen. It just wouldn't happen. So sometimes that progressive enhancement kind of layering is really easy and you kind of get it for free. Sometimes you have to do a little bit more work. For example, things like, like older Android devices, many of those actually don't support CSS animation either, but if you're using some other types of animation, you might need to actually, actively segment those out and be like, what do they call it? Is it the cutting the mustard test? Like you can't handle this, so you only get this part of the code. You don't get this extra bits. So it's definitely a progressive enhancement thing, and definitely something you can handle really, really elegantly, and and plan it. You can easily plan it out in a way, or maybe not super easily, but you can definitely plan it out in a way where you can still take advantage of the newest stuff and provide that to users whose devices and browsers can support it, well, without leaving out people with less capable browsers and devices. And that's kind of like that perfect balance.
Cool. We also had another question from Henry, who's sort of interested, like you kind of touched on it just now when you mentioned Android, but he was interested, do you have any examples of like caveats or issues around animation for mobile, specifically around like performance? So maybe that's having to do with iOS or Android?
I don't have any specific examples of like, if you animate this, it will do poorly on mobile or anything like that. I feel like the context and what you're doing and other things on the side of the page have a big part to play in that too. Also, which devices you're actually dealing with. Some people have different devices they prioritize depending on your content and your audience. Definitely things that use, memory is a big issue on mobile devices, and the idea that like maybe their browser can handle the stuff you're doing, but maybe they don't have like the processing capacity to do it well. So the best way to find those things is to test. And that's really the only way you can know if the animation you're making will perform poorly on mobile. The only way to really know that is to try it on mobile. Because depending on what's happening, sometimes you can get away with a lot on mobile, especially if you're doing a lot of CSS-based animation, because that can be super performant sometimes, or in many cases compared to JavaScript. It's so hard to like make definite things of saying like this will always be performant and this will always not, because it's so much more nuanced than that. But definitely if you're concerned about the performance on mobile, test that out. Definitely to read up on some things about GPU animation. There's some good articles by Paul Lewis, also one that just came out on Smashing pretty recently, that describes this idea of like how browsers promote different things to different layers, which makes them be rendered on the GPU versus the CPU, and how you as a developer can have better control over that. A lot of it for performance in that sense can get, it can just really depend on context and what you're doing is basically what it comes down to.
Awesome. We also had another question from Andrew. He was curious about, do you have any recommendations for prototyping tools?
Yeah, definitely. I do. I talk a lot about prototyping. And the kind of good news is we have a bunch of prototyping tools, perhaps too many prototyping tools, depending on who you ask. The sort of bad thing is I feel like none of them really address all the things or all the main concerns we have, especially as web designers or folks making things for web. You know, many of those prototyping tools are really focused on creating apps or even specific kinds of apps. Like some of them are very focused on iOS apps and not so much on the rest. So we can use them for other things, but it's a bit of a fight. So a couple that work really well, even though they are very iOS focused, are things like Principle, which is a more, I like Framer a lot. It's a very good one for having this kind of like wide open canvas you can make. But again, it's generally very iOS focused, so you can use it for other things. The biggest drawback to that one I find is like you have to write code to make Framer work, and then you have to rewrite it all for production. So that's I feel like the main drawback of most prototyping tools is like you make prototypes and you have to rewrite it for production. There's not very little that crosses over. But those are two great tools for creating prototypes. You can also even use things like Keynote to create prototypes pretty easily and quickly. Obviously no code involved there, but you can do some pretty fun things with that. And for web-based projects, for things that are going to be like on websites or just on the web in general, I tend to just try to actually prototype that in the browser with using GreenSock or some other library and just like throwing together some quick code pens, because I find that gets me closer to something I can use in the real project in the end, and that tends to feel like it works better for me. But the nice thing about having so many tools is, or so many available prototyping tools, is everyone can use the one that works best for the way they like to work. So we got lots of options.
We have another question. I'm not sure what the person's name is. There's just initials, PN. Do you have, can you speak to any current trends or accessibility no-nos? For example, like moving the button out from under a user's mouse.
Yeah, I mean, there's some really obvious stuff like that. Like,
I know you spoke a little bit about specific ones, but maybe you could talk to something to do with accessibility.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of that stuff is there's some common sense things of that too, right? Like, don't move the thing people need to click on. That's not nice. But animation does have some slightly different impacts, I think, on accessibility, partly because it can actually, it can impact accessibility in a very positive way as well as a very negative way. Like, you can't say that animation is always bad for accessibility or that it's always good for accessibility, just like you can't say that for any other type of design tool. But things that we looked at today, like things like establishing that sense of spatial orientation, that idea of like guiding you through the different contexts, that kind of stuff can have a really positive impact on accessibility, because those are the kinds of things that reduce the cognitive load of using your interface and can really make a difference for folks that maybe, for whatever reason, aren't able to give it their full attention or can't follow those context changes without that actual visual transition. So a lot of that kind of stuff can be very, very good for accessibility. Things that essentially use motion and animation to show information in a different way that could make it easier for people to grasp than it would have been otherwise. On the other end of the spectrum, there's also more things to consider that we didn't have to for non-motion interfaces, things like vestibular disorders, and the idea that like really large chunks of motion or a lot of motion can make people dizzy or give them headaches. Like, there's all sorts of things. We saw that a lot. I think it was with iOS 7 where Apple started doing those kind of really zoomy transitions, and it actually made some people sick, like actually physically sick, which is a little bit crazy in a way. Like, it's not a thing you really had to consider before. So that led to Apple to creating this sort of like reduced motion setting and all that kind of stuff. And that's something we need to consider for the web too. I wrote an article, I guess a little over a year ago now, for a list apart about this idea of like creating animations that can be safe for folks with vestibular disorders and kind of navigating that space. There's also been some interesting developments recently about a reduced motion media query of sorts. There's a CSS Tricks article on that. I think just in this past week. It's just a newer thing that's coming up. It's Safari only right now. So there's definitely some interesting things going on in that space. And I'm kind of curious to see where that goes. I think we're on a good path with that as far as web animation goes.
We have another question from Chris. He's curious how much time you typically budget for user like UI improvements like animation. So say if there's an existing website and somebody wants you to come in and sort of animate some motion there.
Well, I guess, I mean, the short answer is I don't budget time specifically for animation. I consider it part of the design process. Which is perhaps not the answer people want to hear, so sorry, but that's how I do it. I consider it part of the design. So like if we are going to spend 10 hours on design, which is a very short amount of time on design, but it's a nice even number, like that would include designing like layout, considering the design of motion and layout and color and all those kinds of things. I find that it's most successful when you consider it part of the design and a thing that you design with. Like, you know, just like you might decide or spend time deciding which typeface best represents your brand, you can decide where animation might most add to the experience and that kind of thing. When you separate it out as its own thing and be like, oh, we'll get to the animation hours at the end of the project, it tends to just not really gel very well. Like the best animation comes out of considering it all throughout design and as part of the design versus this extra thing. Of course, the second half of your question was sort of a little bit of a different situation. Like, if there was an existing site where someone was hiring you just to add motion, maybe I would, but that's also, I feel like that would be more like a redesign effort as opposed to a let's just add motion effort. The more you can pair it with an overall design effort, I think the more successful the results will be.
And I just have one last question for you. What's the hardest animation problem that you've had to solve that you've been working on recently or in the past?
Oh, that's a good question. I think some of the hardest ones are maybe the very, very complex interactions. Like I was working on a project recently where we were prototyping out some different ways, different animations around to sort of like add to cart, edit your cart, you know, view your cart sort of interactions. And those things, because of the different sorts of data that might be in there, like you could have 50 items or one item, like then it becomes very complex to kind of do that efficiently and do it, you know, in a way that is both good to interact with and looks good, even when you have one thing or like 50 things. You know, that kind of expansion or allowing for all of those different possibilities can get really complex.
I think that's actually it for questions now. Thank you so much for answering that.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so thank you so much for today. I am not the only one that learned something from today's presentation and listening for the past hour. And thank you everyone for attending. If you're interested in checking out any of our upcoming webinars, you can just go to our webinars page on the Partner Web Design and Development blog. And I think that's everything. So thank you so much again, Val, and thanks so much for everyone who's attended. Hope that you got something out of it. And we will be we'll be sending out a copy of the webinar to everybody who attended today. Cool. Bye, everyone.